Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Superhero Movie. I was kind of hesitant about doing this movie just because of how, many scenes and how complex it is, and really also how reasonably I could be worried that I'm doing an overly complex film and then it could be having a view count of zero. Just going like, man, I just spent so much time on this one and I really put my best foot forward and, yeah. Um, it could really just do me in the end. Just like, man, like I felt good about this. Going into this review, I do enjoy this film. I really also feel that really this movie was done during a certain period of time. We end up having this movie really very much tied to the very original Spider-Man movie. What am I thinking? There could be at some points in time where it feels like the Superman film, but especially like towards the end where they have them just like continually falling forever. That kind of feels like the Superman thing going on there. Uh, Going on into this movie, I do really enjoy the fact that we end up having a original superhero and we do have an original villain. Like it's not a blatant copy and paste of like, well, we're just gonna obviously just go with Red Goblin or Spider Lad or something. Like no, like it actually is nice to actually have a Hourglass and Dragonfly, even though Hourglass just has an absurd power that doesn't quite make any sense. We really have it to where Hourglass is needing to desperately suck the life out of every human being so he can live an hour longer is just such a goofy concept. But they roll with it, they do it, and we end up having eventually where the concept of the end is just to try and have Hourglass try to massively consume as many as people as possible so he can live forever, so he can be an immortal, and eventually he ends up finding that out. Really, within this story, it's kind of fun to watch this character kind of play with his powers. Eventually, that ends up going horribly awry. It seems like plenty enough times that also we end up having eventually, of course, Rick Riker's family eventually dying somewhere in this film because, of course, that tends to happen as well. We end up having also Rick, who is eventually seemingly almost peeping Tomming over this girl named Jill, his neighbor, consistently watching over her as she goes to seemingly change for the morning, where she consistently, I guess, had wore her lingerie to bed, and eventually ends up going from bra to bra, and so on and so forth. We end up having, of course, having Lance Landers kind of playing the generic bully in this movie, to where, luckily, he did not have a more prominent role in this film, but I'm sure if they would have done sequels for this movie, I'm sure they would have probably gone with the Spider-Man 3 route with that character, to where eventually he probably would have been the Minute Glass or something, the Day Glass, the it would have been some kind of like it would have been some kind of joke on time. It would have been something joking with that. Like, I'm sure they could have came up with some kind of time joking thing for a sequel. Going into this movie, I thought that reasonably we end up having a lot of stuff going on, and not every bit and part of it is important. Like, I think the whole like Stephen Hawking thing was just kind of like, why is this actually in this film? Why is this deemed important? Plus, I guess it also is just a thing to just toss in there to help people do transitions, I guess, at some points. Uh, Really, I also thought that bizarrely having a Professor X mentor in this movie, Professor Xavier mentor in this movie, was kind of like, okay, what is the. Like, they just wanted to do that just to add in that joke. There was not any real true thing coming out of that whole Professor Xavier thing where I thought that they were going to give Dragonfly his costume or try to help him figure anything really and truly out. Like, I thought that Professor Xavier would have been the Tony Stark to Spider-Man Homecoming Spider-Man, where they end up giving him the suit and giving him his name and everything like that, and then just sending him on his way. Uh, Kind of eventually having him doing like some kind of danger room scenario where it ends up everything is like blowing up in his face, and then eventually they just send him on his way to like, oh, okay, like you did it, like you you beat this thing stupidly, but you beat it. Like, hey, here's your costume, there's your name, and there you go. uh, I think that's what should have actually happened, like legitimately, but to where then eventually we would have Rick Riker who would eventually go and just be like, yeah, I guess this should be my costume. It fits perfectly, bizarrely. Like, it's kind of interesting how we end up having it to where Rick didn't even know he was actually bitten by the dragonfly, and so I don't quite understand how exactly Rick decided to go and be a dragonfly because he can actually do this thing called fly. Um, Really, that's the whole problem. The goofy thing with this film is that, hey, Rick can't fly. Why is he called the Dragonfly? And we end up having like Tom Cruise butting in and saying like, this kid can't even fly. Like, what is he doing here? Like, what is he doing as a superhero? And eventually, we end up having Tom Cruise mention that he could fly, and then we eventually see what happens with him in this movie. So, not the actual Tom Cruise, just some guy who comes in to parody movies time from time and says that he's Tom Cruise. So, going on in this movie, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that they intertwine together. It's not all like a Marvel way about going about things. We end up having also Rick's supposedly way of which that his parents were to die felt more like a Batman story than anything else. So there's kind of a mixture of a bunch of superhero stuff within here, and not a lot of all of it makes like absolute sense of how it like commingles with one another, but that's the point of the movie, where it's just a fun little like transition and whatever to help you just kind of have a fun ride throughout this movie, and to have you remember, oh, this is a Batman scene, this is a Spider-Man scene. Well, this is obviously like Fantastic Four, I guess, did really well at this point in time, so I guess they're making a joke about that, and so on and so forth. So, with that said, I think I've talked long enough about this movie in a very cryptic-like sense. Very fun variety movie, but at the end of the day, it's time for me to say spoilers. So I am going to try and figure out how exactly to talk about this film in the most roundabout way possible. Because there's a lot of stuff that I probably will forget along this spoiler time. Because there's a lot of parts to this movie, and plus, also at some point, I'm gonna be probably looking down to just be like trying to figure out how to exactly transition. Because I kind of went on YouTube and it seems like they have a cluster of like scenes that are all cut out. So hopefully this is all in line with the movie, or otherwise I'm gonna be a little bit effed. But anyways, so let's go on to the coveted spoiler time. So, spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, in the very beginning of this movie, we have Rick who immediately tells us that my story is not for the faint at heart, exactly like Spider Man did in the very beginning of his Spider Man movie. We end up having, of course, having Spider Man, or Spider Man, a Spider Man movie done within here. So we end up having Rick Riker, who is, of course, chasing after his bus. And so we immediately have it to where Rick is eventually finally going to have the bus driver stop. And of course, we end up having Rick getting hit by the stop sign that is attached to this bus. So we end up having Rick, who ends up going on to this bus and starts to try to find his seat. We end up having him just kind of looking and checking to see like which person he wants to sit with, and it seems like there was one girl that he has no interest in sitting next to, and there's another girl that he doesn't even think is an actual girl. Could be a dude. And then we eventually end up having Rick that ends up sitting next to Trey. We end up finding out that Trey has some technological lunch, which we end up having Rick drinking off of some iPod that's called iDrink, and so he's drinking out of it as if it's some like flask or something. And we end up having also Trey asking Rick if he has any AA batteries so that way he can eat his lunch from Sony. Anyways, we end up having it to where we immediately have Trey that ends up telling us all these kinds of different kind of cliques that are on this bus. And so we eventually end up having Trey kind of mention all these different cliques that are on this bus. I don't know why. We end up having also like eventually having Frodo's on this bus. It's weird. We eventually have people who end up just punching people in the face to try and get into some kind of clique. And so we end up having Trey who ends up punching Rick in the face and mentioning like, hey man, am I in the clique? And they're like, no. And he's like, man. So we push on to eventually have all these people on this bus who aren't immediately going to school. They're just immediately going to this field trip. And so we end up having it to where eventually it seems that we have Dr. Strong giving this tour of Lou Lander's experimental lab, where it seems that he is talking to some students about certain animals that had gotten loose and all kinds of dangerous animals that I guess have gotten loose. And so we eventually have it to where we end up having eventually Rick seeing both Lance Landers and Lou Landers talking to one another, and we end up having Lou Landers who is eventually coughing off to the side, and we end up having Rick notice this, and Rick is like, hey, Mr. Landers, are you okay? And he's like, oh, that's good cough blood. That's healthy cough blood. And I'm like, oh my god, that has got to be the most hilarious thing of this entire film. I've seen this before. I've seen this plenty of times before, but every single time I laugh at that. I'm like, oh no, this is healthy cough blood. So we eventually have it to where we have eventually Lance is to eventually trip Rick, and so Rick ends up falling right into a seemingly ground full of crap. And so we end up having Rick trying to find some cleaning products to be able to try and spray away the crap that is on his shirt. But we end up having Dr. Strom telling us that it seems that there is some chemical that has pheromones, and that actual chemical is H2O9. Where coincidentally we end up having Rick who shifts the bottle to realize that that is H2O9, to where we end up seeing all of a sudden all of these animals coming out of the woodwork to tackle down Rick and hump the life out of him one by one. So we eventually have it to where after all these animals stop humping Rick, we eventually have also this dragonfly who ends up stinging Rick on the neck. So we eventually push on to eventually having Rick eventually going home to eventually have it to where his parents is mentioning how Rick, or technically his uncle, because his uncle is his uncle of course is Uncle Albert, and his aunt is Aunt Lucille, there we go. Was I even saying that? Oh yeah, it was Dr. Strom. I was like, am I even saying the doctor's name right? So we end up having Lucille and Albert who are talking about Rick, and so Rick ends up coming home and he looks like really sick, to the point to where he's like vomiting in the fish aquarium. And because we end up having Uncle Albert suggesting to Rick, hey man, like, you gotta feed those fish. And we end up having Rick who ends up vomiting in the aquarium. And he's like, yeah, good for you. You did it. You fed the fish. So we end up having Rick who ends up going on to go and sleep this off. And so we end up having to now showcase what is going on with Lou Landers. So Lou Landers is going with a bunch of these executive-like people. It's kind of the Norman Osborn story, where we end up having this guy named Carlson who is kind of getting very antsy about what Lou Landers is going to show them. And so we end up having Lou Landers who is showcasing this experiment, which they're having a severely tough time trying to get the sheet off of. So we end up having Lou Landers who ends up showcasing that this weird, bizarre-ish looking chair thing is to make it to where Lou Landers could live longer, because it seems that Lou Landers only has the ability to live for another hour and then he will die, bizarrely. Because it seems like Dr. Strom had perfectly timed this to where Lou Landers is going to die in the next hour. So we end up having Lou Landers who goes into this bizarrish chair, does this experiment, and it doesn't work, to where Carlson is like, man, I knew that this was a sham. Like, how dare you, like, try to put this experiment on us, and, like, it's not what it is at all. And so we eventually have Carlson who ends up touching on to Lou Landers, and we end up having us see that Lou Landers had now sucked the life out of Carlson, and so we end up eventually having it to where Lou Landers is to realize that he is becoming younger. So we end up having Lou Landers who ends up deciding to consume every one of these executive types because there is going to be some changes into new management. We also eventually have, at some point, Lou Landers eventually going to his assistant in some point of this movie and then sucking the life out of her, and then we end up having Lou Landers eventually trying to hide the body, and so it ends up looking like he is actually having some kind of affair with his assistant, to where the janitor ends up walking and he's like, I didn't see nothing, and he ends up walking out. So, pushing on, so we end up eventually having Rick, who is to wake up the next day to go to school, and so we end up having, bizarrely, that there is some kind of science fair like thing going on, where we end up having Stephen Hawking, who is to be, I guess, the judge of this science fair, bizarrely. And so we end up having it to where that is when Rick, all of a sudden, his superpowers are starting to kick in. We end up having him starting to stick to everything. So we end up having Rick going off to eventually go and get a thing of water from this fountain, and his hands stick. We end up having Rick trying to get his hands unstuck, and he ends up ripping the fountain from off the wall to smack it right into Lou Landers, or Lance Landers, I mean. And so we end up having, bizarrely, this moment to where, one, Rick is eventually dodging all of the punches of Lance Landers, and then eventually we end up having it to where eventually Rick gets too overly confident and then eventually ends up getting freaking hit anyways. We end up having eventually Rick, who is to eventually stick into any number of things. Eventually we end up having Rick, who ends up sticking onto his principal's shirt, of course, and ripping her shirt, to where eventually you end up seeing a bit of her underwear underneath. We end up having, of course, Rick eventually sticking, I guess, to another teacher, to where he completely rips all of his clothes off. We end up having Rick eventually to run off eventually and go on to eventually realize that he can seemingly stick to anything, and then we end up having the crawl up the floor wall moment. And then eventually we also have Rick, who ends up seeing an old lady in distress, because we end up having a guy who cannot control his brakes. We end up having Rick, who ends up pushing the old lady out of the way and pushing his body into the semi to where it is to stop. And so we end up having everybody going like, oh my god, you just saved that old lady. And then eventually, while they're praising Rick for saving this old lady, we see the old lady in the background getting eaten by this like wood chipper of sorts and being killed off, to where Rick is like, ah. But we also have at some point, like I said, Rick is very much also a peeping Tom, and so we end up having, in the very beginning of this movie, early parts of this movie, we end up having Rick, who is watching over Jill as she is to go and change for the morning and stuff like that. We end up having consistently Rick kind of looking over and just going like, if only I could just get a little snippet of Jill. Ah. It's so interesting. So, pushing on even more. So, we end up having Rick, who ends up going home to eventually tell his Uncle Albert that he can seemingly dodge all kinds of punches and that he has superpowers. And we end up having, of course, Rick saying like, hey, like, throw any punch and I bet you $100 that it'll miss. So we end up having Uncle Albert, who ends up punching Trey in the face, and he's like, well, that was the easiest $100 that I ever made. And we end up having also that they try to figure out if Rick has diamond hard skin or not, and so Uncle Albert just stabs Rick in the chest, and he's like, well, I guess you are, like, I guess you do have diamond hard skin. Uh, and also, we end up having it to where uh, we end up having seemingly Uncle Albert is, I guess, putting up some part of furniture or some kind of something in the home, like some kind of shelf of something, and we end up having accidentally Uncle Albert going and shooting a nail gun off, and Rick ends up catching it, and he's like, "How did you do that?" Plus, also there's a hilarious moment where Rick was when he had first gotten his powers, and he ends up waking up. He immediately asks, like, "Man, how long have I been sleeping for?" And Uncle Albert is sleeping next to him, and like 5 days, and then he ends up waking up and getting up out of Rick's bed. It's freaking hilarious. So we end up eventually having Rick, who is to go home after talking to Uncle Albert. Rick is to go into his room to eventually have a email of sorts, because we end up having Rick, who is trying to figure out his symptoms, and eventually the only thing that the computer is asking is if um, Rick has ever gotten laid or not. So we end up eventually having a person that is to do a video to Rick mentioning that he's Professor Xavier and he wants to help Rick. And we also have this video doing a lot of buffering to where it absolutely makes no sense. Uh, he's like, hey, like, two girls, one cup. Low prices, whichever can fly. I'll leave that all up to you. And Rick is like, what? So we go on to eventually have it to where Rick is to eventually talk with Professor Xavier and go to his school. And so we end up having this whole thing where they are to basically show some supposedly X-Men that you know, like Wolverine, who is bizarrely shaving his legs off to the side of uh, some part of the mansion somewhere. And we eventually have it to where Xavier is watching over Storm teaching some class, and he's like, "Hey, Storm, get that booty tight." So we eventually have it to where Xavier is going to eventually seeing Mrs. Xavier, and so we end up having her tell us that it seems that Mrs. Xavier is to have two kids, and it seems that Miss Xavier finds out that Professor Xavier is cheating on her with Invisible Woman. To her Invisible Woman is actually Pam Anderson, and I'm like, oh wow, like this was kind of an interesting thing to see Pam Anderson in this movie as Invisible Woman. Um, Plus, also eventually we end up also having a scene with Human Torch, where when eventually Dragonfly eventually gets his powers, we end up having him trying to lean over onto this gargoyle like a normal like Batman would do, and eventually we end up having the Human Torch like also wanting to like stoop onto this same gargoyle with Dragonfly, and so they both stoop together onto this onto this gargoyle, and that doesn't quite work. It seems very uncomfortable. But then eventually, we end up having the Human Torch showing off his powers, but then he gets super afraid by his powers, and so that's when Rick tries to douse out the flames of the Human Torch, and that just accelerates things further. And we end up having eventually that the Human Torch falls off the roof, and we never see him again throughout this movie. But anyways, so uh, we end up having it, and I guess that's the next scene that happens after this, I hope. So we end up having, from all of this dialogue here, from really just Dragonfly going to this mansion, really just the whole thing about him going to this mansion is just for him to be told that he needs to have a superhero suit. He needs to be able to become a superhero. And so we end up having Dragonfly, who ends up making his own suit. There is some rough drafts that seem very bizarre. We end up having at some point, like we end up having Dragonfly or Rick, who ends up thinking that uh, he should go and do a wedding dress of sorts, and as for a costume, and it looks really bizarre. Uh, and so we eventually have it to where Dragonfly ends up putting up his costume, and that's where we end up getting the Human Torch scene. We end up having at some point in this movie, we end up having Rick, who is very hesitant about becoming a superhero, to where eventually Uncle Albert has to give Rick the ring of his father. We end up having this entire backstory of Rick getting to eventually see his mother and father die via this theater scene. We end up having both Blaine and Julia Riker going out of this theater with Rick, and we have, of course, eventually have them watching over these homeless people, to where we are to like showcase how a dog goes and like drinks out of a sacked drink like a normal human would, which I thought was an hilarious scene. The very first time I saw this movie, I died laughing at that scene where the dog is taking that little drink of something. I died laughing while watching this movie the first time. So we end up having Rick, who ends up going to eventually have his parents being held up at gunpoint, and we end up having Blaine, who is telling Rick that he needs to be a hero, and so we end up having Rick, who ends up trying to stop this mugger, and while Rick is stopping this mugger, we end up having shots being fired off repetitiously, to where eventually we end up having things go and get hit by a bullet, which ends up sending something to hit any number of his parents, to where eventually, or we end up having these guns just shooting either Julian or Blaine, seemingly to the point of basically near death, or they end up just getting hit by things from these bullet ricochets or whatever to make them almost get killed over and die. So we eventually have it to where Rick is getting his last sad story of Blaine, like telling him like one last little kernel of knowledge. And so we end up having Blaine, who ends up giving Rick his family inherited ring. And we end up having Rick, who ends up dropping this ring into Blaine's mouth, to where we end up having Rick, who ends up having to like punch Blaine in the chest for him to kick out this ring for Rick to be able to grab it. And so we end up having Blaine telling Rick that he needs to no longer invest in this thing called Google, to put all of his money into a thing called Enron, and he'll be fine. And so we eventually have Rick seeing his father die. And so we eventually have it to where at some point in this movie, Uncle Albert is to eventually tell Rick what all is in on this ring, to eventually have him get some kind of moral support from a previous ancestor of his. To where we end up seeing that this ring, because if anything, they were kind of making a joke of Lord of the Rings, where there's so much where the ring says. We end up having the inter things of this ring, kind of seeing like honor and valor and low prices and and all this other stuff, and like this and this and this and this and this and 30 other things that make no sense. Here's the thing that bizarrely got me in this news report. And there was a news report that we end up having we end up having Keith David do. So I don't know why that this got me, but it just did. Like I just started like uncontrollably laughing this time around, and I don't know why. So we end up having Keith David mentioning what is actually desperately needed into this town, and we end up having it to where Keith David, this police officer, mentions like, well, yeah, we definitely need a lot more cops and a Hooters. We definitely need a lot more cops, an overwhelming number of cops, but then also a Hooters. I don't know why that just bizarrely just struck me during that point, but anyways, yeah, it is what it is. I just wanted to get that thing out there so I can get that out of the way. So we end up having it to where eventually Dragonfly is to eventually be pushed to go on to eventually fight Hourglass. So we end up seemingly having it to where Lou Landers needs to desperately come up uh, with some kind of way of. Or no, wait, let's back up a little bit. So we end up having eventually Rick, who is to eventually talk to Jill. And so Jill is to eventually mention to Rick how it would be great if he had a car, and so that way they could drive away with one another. And so we end up having Rick, who ends up going to the bank to try to see if he can get out a loan for a car. And we end up having it to where when Rick is to eventually go to the bank originally their slogan is like, hey, like no credit, no money, no problem. But eventually we end up having the banker saying like, well, no, that was our old slogan. Like no money, no credit, like tough, like, no, you're not getting this loan. And eventually we end up having Rick trying to, I guess, try to please this bank loaner under the table, so to speak. But eventually we end up having it to where the loan doesn't go through. So we end up having it to where eventually there seems to be a transition afoot to where we end up having eventually these people trying to rob this bank, and we end up having it to where Rick is seeing that they are to rob this bank and he does nothing. He just actually helps them leave the bank. To where eventually we end up having Dragonfly, who is eventually going out to see like there's a huge circle and commotion going on. And so we end up having Rick realize that it's some dancing monkey. And he's like, well, hey, like, I thought there was some horrible thing going on out here. And it's like, well, yeah, there is some dead guy off to the side. And so we end up finding out that seemingly Uncle Albert ends up dying or ends up getting shot and has to be, like, I guess, put to the hospital. We end up also having it to where eventually also Dragonfly has to forcibly fight out Hourglass. Let's get to this. So we end up having the Hourglass having to desperately go out somewhere to start attacking people. And so we end up having it to where Dragonfly ends up going and fighting the Hourglass, and they end up kind of like putting themselves arm to arm, and all of a sudden like you just start to see them like consistently circle around repetitiously till eventually they're like, whoa, like the camera angle is affecting them, and we end up having the Hourglass vomiting off to the side. And so we end up eventually having it to where the Dragonfly and the Hourglass like start to fight it out, but eventually we end up having it to where eventually the Hourglass eventually ends up getting away, and so like we push on from that. So we eventually have it to where Rick is to eventually bring flowers to Jill because evidently she had done some audition, and so we eventually have it to where Rick is to go off and realize that it seems like Jill is eventually going to be in trouble because it seems like there is a number of thugs that are following after her. So we end up having Rick, who ends up changing into the Dragonfly, and we end up having it to where Rick is starting to, as Dragonfly, beat up these thugs that are after Jill. And we end up having Jill just starting to romantically look at this Dragonfly, and she's like, ah, like, of course, Rick would do before with her. And so we end up having Dragonfly brutally murdering all these thugs, like ramming them into these walls and all kinds of stuff. And while he's doing that, he's also looking at Jill as like, oh, like, and just like ramming these people's heads into a wall, breaking their arms in horrific like ways that don't make sense. But he's still just looking at Jill while he does it. And so we eventually have that moment where we end up having these two almost kiss while the Dragonfly is upside down. So we end up having it to where Jill wanted to thank Dragonfly for saving her life, and so we end up having Dragonfly and Jill having this kiss, but we end up having Dragonfly drop to where we have it to where Dragonfly is where Jill's crotch would be, and vice versa, to where it seems like they were gonna like 69 or something. Pushing on, so we eventually have it to where it seems that Rick is to eventually go home, and evidently Thanksgiving is going on. We end up having it to where Jill is with Aunt Lucille, and they're stuffing a turkey with all kinds of things that don't make sense. We end up having like Aunt Lucille, who is like shoving this turkey with like vodka and a plant and a cat and all kinds of other things. And so we end up having Rick coming into the home, and so we end up having Lance and Lou who end up arriving to come to this Thanksgiving, and we end up having Lou saying like, well, hopefully it's not a burden for me to come in and have Thanksgiving with you guys. And so we eventually have it to where Lou Landers starts to hear like a clatter, and so we end up having Lou who ends up investigating if Rick is home or not. So we end up having Rick who ends up, of course, doing the Spider-Man thing, and he ends up sticking to the wall while in the Dragonfly costume. So we end up having Lou, who is consistently throughout this entire room looking for wherever Rick is, and we end up having him like at first like hiding up on top of the ceiling, but then eventually he ends up like hiding into one of the drawers. He ends up hiding under a desk. He ends up hiding in like a number of different scenarios where Lou just kind of double checks and looks back and ends up seeing that Rick is no longer there. We end up having eventually where Rick is to eventually have to be stuck onto the ceiling, and when Rick was to eventually come into the home, he was going to try and pee. He had to go to the bathroom, and so that's when I guess people thought that he was home. So we end up having Rick who ends up all of a sudden really desperately needing to pee, to the point to where eventually he starts peeing through his costume. And so we end up having it to where eventually Lou is to eventually keep hearing these water dripping like sounds, to where eventually it goes from water dripping to sprinkler to whichever kind of bizarrish peeing sounds that would make sense, to eventually Lou goes and looks at the ceiling to eventually find nothing's there. Eventually we end up having Lou who ends up seeing Dragonfly who's attached to his back, to where he ends up like trying to desperately turn around, and Rick is no longer there. So eventually we end up having it to where Rick arrives, and so we end up eventually having these people who all end up deciding to have Thanksgiving together. And so we end up having it to where Lou is trying to desperately go for some food, and we end up having Aunt Lucille who ends up driving a metal fork into Lou's hand, to where he's like, "Oh my god!" And then we end up having Lou who has to forcibly say grace. So we end up having, of course, the Spider-Man scene where Lou and Rick are to consistently talk about their wounds and how eventually we end up having it to where Lou mentions that he ends up finding a woman on Craigslist, and Rick mentions that he ended up finding a man on Craigslist, and we end up having at some excuse me, we end up having at some point who Rick had busted his lip, and so Rick ultimately mentions that his crack pipe broke, and so on and so forth. So we end up having Rick who ends up having to, or we end up having Lou who ends up realizing that quite possibly Rick could be the Dragonfly, because eventually we end up having also in that fighting scenario, we end up having the Hourglass who ends up going and having these bizarrish knife like balls, where eventually we end up having the Dragonfly who is to have these balls supposedly being things that can be able to cut through diamonds, and we end up having the Dragonfly mention it's like, well, I'm not wearing diamonds, and so we end up having the Hourglass who ends up shooting out all of these balls to eventually have every single one of these balls hit Dragonfly perfectly in the body to where he dodges none of them, which I thought was hilarious. But, and I just remember that now. But anyways, so hence why they had so many wounds of which that they had to talk about. So we end up having it to where to where Lou is to eventually go and try to leave this this Thanksgiving by telling Lance that he ended up crapping himself, and so we end up having them leave to eventually have excuse me, ugh, excuse me, excuse me, ugh. Let me pause here for a second. Whew. Oh man, that was a weird coughing attack there. Anyways, so we end up having it to where eventually Rick and Jill are to eventually sit down. Coincidentally, next where Aunt Lucille is eventually going on to eventually also lay on this couch because she's tired after a big meal. And we end up having coincidentally Aunt Lucille consistently farting while Jill and Rick are continuing to talk to one another about how quite possibly Rick could actually know the Dragonfly, because it seems that he is doing some photos of the Dragonfly. We end up having, of course, Rick, who ends up delivering these photos to a editor, who at first it seems like this editor was going to look just like J. Jonah Jameson, but instead, like, this was just an insane patient. But the actual editor comes in and is like, hey, these photos look actually pretty good. Hey, kid, let's go and, give you a job. So we end up having it to where Jill is mentioning, well, hey, has the Dragonfly talked about me? And, have you mentioned him to me, kind of thing? And we end up having Rick, who ends up trying to do this, heartfelt moment, which is basically snuffed out by really just Aunt Lucille farting repetitiously, to where eventually Jill is covering her nose with tampons, so that way she can just kind of snuff out the smell. And eventually we end up having Rick, who ends up going and lighting a scented candle, but that just has it to where when Aunt Lucille farts, and ends up blowing away the candle with the flame. So we end up having it to where eventually the Hourglass ends up breaking through Rick's home to eventually have it be that the Hourglass wants to be able to talk to the Dragonfly and wants him to meet him at some at some like convention or some kind of like facility, because the Hourglass needs some beryllium or something like that. And so we end up having it to where eventually also the Hourglass is attacking Aunt Lucille once she had woken up. And we end up having it to where eventually Rick goes to the hospital, and the doctor is to basically tell him that his aunt is dead. And so we end up having it to where we end up finding out that it seems like Uncle Albert is actually fully fledgedly alive. And so we end up having them doing a funeral for Aunt Lucille, to where Uncle Albert goes and tries to make out one last time with Aunt Lucille, but then that actually isn't the actual right Aunt Lucille. And so eventually we end up having Uncle Albert going and accidentally burning down the true Aunt Lucille. And so they end up having to forcibly just cremate Aunt Lucille anyways. So, pushing on. So, we eventually have it to where the Dragonfly is to go to this summit. And so, we end up eventually having Rick, who is desperately going to this summit to try and find Hourglass to stop him from getting this beryllium. And here is also a very funny note. We end up having also that the Hourglass is to eventually be told by Dr. Strom that he needs to keep consuming one person a day. He needs to kill every day to live a day. And we eventually have it to where the Hourglass ends up chucking an Hourglass, and we end up having eventually that Hourglass breaking, and there's a bunch of glass that ends up being shot into Lou's face, and we end up having bizarrely, he's like, oh my god, like I have a piece of glass in my eye, and we end up having it to where Dr. Strom is immediately telling him, it's like, well, hey, like, try to put your fingers to, it's like 2 fingers? Like, yeah, it's like, how about you try to get the piece of glass out with another piece of glass? And Lou is like, are you insane? And so he's like trying to figure out like how to get the glass out. And so we eventually have Mr. Strom who's like, well, or Dr. Strom was like, I'll go and get some tweezers to get it out. I'll help you. So it was like, that scene was just hilarious the first time that I saw it too. It's just like they're trying to like figure out how to get like Lou's like glass out of his eye. Because I immediately was always like, in every single movie, I was like, you know what? I don't know how many times somebody's been hit with glass, and there was never usually time where that would ever affect anybody. Like, if anything, there's that Brightburn moment where we end up having the woman take out, like, a piece of glass out of her eye, which is so disgusting. But, like, very rarely do we ever have people actually be picking glass off of their body when there's obviously an event of that ends up happening. But anyways, so we end up having Rick, who ends up going to eventually... and we also have it to where, like, Trey was also trying to continue to ask Rick about him being his sidekick, which I thought was really fun. To where Rick was trying to come up with some, or Trey was trying to come up with some names for himself, and it's like, but dude, you don't actually have superpowers. But anyways, so we end up having Rick, who ends up going to this summit, and so we end up having, of course, where we have it to where it seems that I'm gonna pause here for a second. All right, we end up having Lou Landers, who is going to this like summit or whatever it is. It kind of looks like a United Worlds like meeting or whatever, but so we end up having Lou Landers going to this summit or whatever, And so we end up having him getting the award of douchebag of the year. And so we end up having Lou, who ends up getting this award and is to eventually just walk off and throw this douchebag award just in the trash. So we end up having Rick, who ends up asking, hey, like, he ends up asking Lou, hey, like, I think that the hourglass is here in the summit, and I need to figure out exactly where he is. Do you think you can? Do you think you know who the hourglass could possibly be? Because we end up having it immediately where the hourglass can figure out that that Rick is the dragonfly, but on the opposite spectrum, Rick is so dumb that he can't figure out that Lou is actually the hourglass. So we end up eventually having it to where Lou is saying that like the Dalai Lama or whatever is the hourglass, and so we end up having it to where Rick goes as Dragonfly to attack this Dalai Lama guy, this monk-looking guy, and he ends up ripping off all of his clothes to try to see that there is an hourglass costume underneath, and we end up having the actual hourglass going ripping off his shirt to showcase that he is the hourglass and eventually is going to attack the dragonfly. Here's one little thing, like the one little funny anecdote or whatever. We end up having Dragonfly, who eventually his first rough draft of his costume. I thought it was fun that we ended up having Trey, who ended up seeing Dragonfly full on in his costume, and there was no air pockets, and there was also like no ability for him to get out of the costume, to where it seems like he had sewed himself in bizarrely into the costume. And eventually, when Rick starts to realize that, we end up having Rick scrambling and like he can't see, and he also can't like breathe, and so he ends up smacking into a bunch of things and falling over, which I thought was hilarious. So we end up having the hourglass, who is going on to eventually go into his bizarrish chair device thing and eventually try and fight out Dragonfly and try to also consume people as well as he is to go on here. So we eventually have it to where both Dragonfly and the hourglass are fighting to the point of fighting through this wall of sorts to eventually have Dragonfly realize that, one, the hourglass had gotten away from him, and so we end up having Dragonfly, who ends up seeing a person that is dressed like the hourglass, and so that is actually not the actual hourglass, it's some person that looks like him. And so we end up finding out that now we transition to see that Hourglass is in some Comic-Con, but it is called like Hero Con or something like that. And we end up having Dragonfly, who's like, wow, like, why is it that like I am here? And so we also have some point in this movie where I thought it was kind of hilarious when Rick was to have this like fake beard, and eventually we end up having Uncle Albert realizing that it's a fake beard, because eventually we end up having, of course, Rick kind of giving up on his powers and whatever because he can't actually fly, and everybody makes a joke about him that he can actually fly. So we go on to eventually have Rick, who is trying to fight off the hourglass in this Hero Con. And we eventually have it to where eventually the hourglass has Jill, and so now the Dragonfly has to fight the hourglass on some rooftop. And so we end up having it to where eventually Dragonfly has to save Jill because she is falling off this rooftop. So Dragonfly dives after her and grabs her, but the only problem is there's nothing he can do about it. So he's like, man, I desperately have to fly now. And plus we have it to where this seemingly skyscraper or building that they're on like has a million bajillion floors to where they're falling forever. to where we end up having it to where Rick is like, oh my god, thankfully I was able to fly just when I was able to, because otherwise, like, there was only 50 more floors for us to decide what to do. So we end up having Rick and we end up having Dragonfly and Jill flying back up to the top. So we end up eventually having it to where Rick has to now fight off the hourglass, and so we end up having it to where eventually that the hourglass is to throw some hour bomb that ends up attaching to Rick's junk, and so we end up having Rick desperately asking Jill to pull this bomb off of his junk. They're like, hey, could you tug at this? Could you pull at this? And Jill is like, no. And so we end up having Rick who decides, well, there's not enough time. So we end up having Rick who ends up flipping onto the hourglass to where the bomb is placed onto the hourglass's face. And he's like, oh, mother. And then we end up having a big explosion to where, of course, Rick does survive, but the hourglass ends up being killed off. So eventually, I think that is most of what ends up happening through a bulk of this movie. I had to take so long to be able to do, and plus there was a ton of stuff that I also forgot, because there's a lot of crap going on in this movie. And plus, also I didn't want to spend, like, I probably had to go back several times to mention some little thing, and more than likely, I'm going to hugely regret something that I didn't talk about, or like I'm just like, oh, but this joke and that joke and so on and so forth. There's so much to unpack in this review that really more than likely there might be some scene that I forgot about. Let me know in the comments below what you felt about this movie. If you like the fact that it was just a parody of Spider-Man. Maybe you also liked some other superhero movie that kind of reminded you of any number of things, like the Batman scene or something like that. Let me also know in the comments below if there are some comedic superhero movies. Some people might like movies like Super or some other things that are mostly just used for comedic purposes, maybe like a Blank Man or something like that, something goofy or funny. More than likely, that might be something that I review in the future. But with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.